chapter 6. So this is our first real kind of physiology chapter of the semester. So you want to pay attention to all the definitions, and then we're going to look at the steps of how we sort of build our bones up and make them longer. So the first thing we want to do is just look at the basic structure of bones, and again, just cover some basic definitions. And we want to remember one important thing. So it says basic structure, types, and locations. And what you want to really think of is that the human skeleton initially, okay, is going to be made up of cartilage, and it's going to be made up of these fibrous membranes, and then eventually we're going to replace these with bone, okay? And there's a big reason that we kind of do this. So growth of cartilage. So unlike bone, cartilage has a flexible matrix. We talked about matrices a lot in the tissue chapter, but it's ideal for laying down the embryonic skeleton, so the initial skeleton, and allowing for new skeletal growth. Okay, so cartilage is going to grow in two ways. You get two good definitions here. You get appositional growth, okay, which is growth of cartilage on the external surface of existing cartilage, so good multiple choice question. And then you have interstitial growth, which is going to be growth of cartilage from within, okay? So interstitial, inter usually means, within or inside. Makes it a little bit easier to remember. But again, we're forming our skeleton using cartilage, and then we're going to kind of make it bigger and bigger and bigger and use that cartilage to kind of grow the skeleton, and then gradually we're going to replace all of that cartilage with bone. Okay, so now we come down to, in most chapters, especially as we move on to bones and muscles and nervous system, we're going to always talk about the functions. So you have 7 functions of bones. Again, good multiple choice question, because they can be like, hey, which of these is not a function of your bone? Most of these, if we just sat down right now and I said, take a piece of paper and write down what you think the functions of your bones are going to be, you're going to get most of them. There's just going to be a couple that are maybe just a little bit trickier. So the first one is support. So it provides the framework that supports the body and cradles its soft organs. Number 2 is protection. This is one we've already talked a lot about. So this is where my bones are going to protect my brain, my spinal cord, my vital organs. We've talked about anchorage a little bit. We might not have used the term anchorage, but we know that we're attaching our skeletal muscles to the bones, and then we're going to use those muscles to create force so that we can kind of create this motion of the body. So we're using our bones to kind of create these levers and these joints so that the muscles can be the force to kind of move us around. And then number 4 is the mineral and growth factor storage. A lot of us kind of know that there's calcium in our bones. So again, you want to think about this one as this, we're using our bones as a reservoir for certain minerals. Number 5 is blood cell formation. This is one that most people kind of don't think about, but most blood cell formation is going to occur in the cavities of your bones. Okay, so that's one that people forget a lot of times. And then we also want to remember, excuse me, that there's we also have fat stored in our bones, or triglyceride storage. So we're going to have this fat energy, and we're going to use this, when energy is needed, and we're going to store this in the cavity of our bones also. So the last 2 are the ones that most people kind of forget about, is that we use our bones for blood cell formation, and we use it to store fat for our body when needed. So here's number 7, is our hormone production, osteocalcin. So it's going to stimulate insulin release by the pancreas. This is another one that's a little trickier. It's going to cause an increase in glucose uptake, okay? And it's also going to enhance our exercise capacity. But anytime you see, osteo in a name, you know that it has something to do with the bones. And then obviously we get this calcin, which is, going to give us another kind of clue as to what the hormone's going to kind of do for us. So now we move on to classifying our bones. And again, we've already gone through chapter 7, and we went through the joint chapter, and we know that we have different kind of bones in our body. And now we just want to make sure that we can classify them properly. So there's 206 bones in the body. They're going to be divided into 2 groups. We've already looked at these. We know there's an axial skeleton, and we know that there's an appendicular skeleton. Okay, and the axial skeleton, again, was the long axis of the body, so skull, vertebrae, rib cage, protects, supports, carries body parts, but again, the main function of that axial skeleton is to protect the brain, the organs, and the spinal cord. And we looked at the appendicular skeleton. So this one, we're using it for motion. So we're using it for locomotion. You also want to remember that we're using it to manipulate our environment. So it's not always just walking, running, and jumping. It's also the movement in the upper extremities too. Going to include all the bones of the upper and lower limbs. And then we mentioned a bunch of times that the one mistake people make is that they consider the girdles part of that axial skeleton. But your shoulder girdle and your pelvic girdles are going to be part of the appendicular skeleton. So now we look at another way we can classify our bones, and that is by shape. So we have long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. So So long bones are going to have an elongated shape. They're going to be longer than they are wide. They're also going to have a shaft, and then they're going to have two ends. These are going to include all limb bones except for your kneecap or patella and your wrist and your ankle bones. Okay, so most of the bones in the body are going to be these long bones. We're also going to have short bones. They're going to be roughly cube-shaped. They're going to include the bones of the wrist and the ankles. They're also going to include the patella or the sesamoid bones that are formed within a tendon. We're going to have flat bones. These are thin, flattened, and usually a bit curved. And you can probably think about, okay, where are some of the flat bones in my body? But this is going to be your sternum, your scapula, your ribs, and then most of your skull bones are also going to be these flat bones. And then we have our last category, which is the irregular bones, and these are going to be the complicated shape ones. We saw these with the vertebrae. That's probably the best example. But they get their own category because they don't fit into any of the previous classes. Okay, so hip bones, vertebrae are going to be examples of our irregular bones. Okay, and here's our little picture of our long bone. This is what we think about when we think about bones. You have your flat bones, you have your irregular shaped ones, and then we also have our short bones in the wrists and the ankles. So bones are classified as organs because they're going to contain different types of tissue. Okay, so we go back to our definitions of like what's an organ, what's a tissue, all those different little classifications. Osseous tissue or bone tissue is going to dominate, but they're also going to contain nerves, and we know that because when you break a bone, it's really, really sensitive and really painful, so you know there's a lot of nerves in there. They're going to contain cartilage. We saw this because we said we're going to cover the ends of the bones where they form their joints in hyaline cartilage to create these joints and create our movements. They're going to have dense connective tissue coverings on the external surface. We'll talk about that in a second. They're also going to have muscle tissue, and they're going to have epithelial tissue. And these two are included. These are also the ones that people forget about. But you want to remember that there's blood vessels kind of traveling through all your different bones, kind of everywhere, kind of branching out throughout your bones. And there's muscle in those blood vessels, and there's epithelial tissue in those blood vessels so that I can kind of contract and dilate the vessels and control that blood flow. So when you look at this picture, we realize, because sometimes we think it's just this thick piece of bone, but we want to remember that there's a lot of other things going in there, and we want to remember that there's all these little openings and all these little blood vessels and nerves that are going everywhere throughout your bones, okay? And then we'll come back to this picture in a second when we start looking at the bone structure. So now we get to the gross anatomy of bones. Bones are made up of a combination of compact and spongy bone. They have a dense outer layer of compact bone, okay, and then they have this inner layer of spongy bone, and this is going to be your trabecula. So the inner spongy bone is we're going to create these honeycomb-like pieces. If we were in the lab, we have some bones that are actually cut up, and you guys could see the trabecular bone really good. But we're going to create all these open spaces between the trabecula, and then we're going to be able to kind of fill those up with our bone marrow. And this does a couple things for us. It makes the outer part really, really strong, but it also helps to make the bones a little bit lighter too, because if they were just solid, our bones would be really heavy. So we're trying to create these really strong structures, but we're trying to make them as light as possible so that we can move around as easily as we can. So here are the structural differences of bones. So structure of short and irregular flat bones. Okay, so these are the short, irregular, and flat bones. They have a simple design. They're going to consist of thin plates of spongy bone, and then they're going to be covered by that compact bone. Okay, but what they're not going to have is a bunch of cavities. Okay, and when you get into the long bones, you're going to see that we have these cavities in there. Okay, so here's a picture of our skull, and your textbook does a great job of showing you the general picture of kind of what they're zooming in on. So this is part of our skull bones here, and I can see that I have the outer and the inner layer of compact bone, and I'm going to use that to kind of sandwich that layer of spongy bone. Okay, and then here's a zoomed in picture of all the trabeculae. You can see that I've created all these little open spaces, and then I can kind of store things through there, and I can have all the blood vessels that are kind of traveling through there too. Okay, so here are our long bones. So they're going to be a little bit different. They're going to consist of a shaft, which is going to be termed the diaphysis, and they're going to also have ends, so bone ends, and those are going to be called the epiphysis. And then we're also going to have our membranes, and those are going to be the periosteum and the endosteum. And you can even now, we can sort of start breaking down words and sort of thinking about, okay, where's one going to be? This kind of lets you know that one's going to be probably inside and one's going to be on the outside because we get that endo part. So start trying to just kind of practice, figuring out those words are, and then we'll go through the proper definitions too. So here is the diaphysis. So it's the tubular shaft forms the long axis of the bone. Okay, it's constructed of a thick collar of compact bone, It's going to surround the central medullary cavity. Okay, and that's the biggest difference between the long bones and all the other bones, is that we're going to have these cavities, and then in those cavities we're going to store our marrow. Okay, so in this one, in the diaphysis of the long bone, it's going to contain the yellow marrow in adults, and we'll talk about red marrow versus yellow marrow in a second too. But I can see this is one of my long bones, kind of half of a long bone, and I can see this is going to be the shaft part or the diaphysis. And I can see that in there we're going to have this little cavity, and then it gives you a picture of that little marrow that's kind of stored in there. Okay, and I can also see the epiphysis, where it kind of widens, so the bone ends is going to be the epiphysis. So here is my epiphysis. Bone ends are usually broader than the diaphysis. Outer shell is again compact bone. Inner is going to be spongy bone. You get a thin layer of articular hyaline cartilage that covers the joint surface. Very important for arthritis and keeping our joints and bones kind of pain-free. And then again, that layer of cartilage is going to help us to just cushion the ends of the bones and make them kind of go across each other a little bit smoother. So they're going to assist with movement. They're going to assist a little bit in absorbing stress. And again, staying healthy and pain-free as you get older is all about maintaining that cartilage on the ends of your bones. Okay, we're also going to see an epiphyseal line. We saw that a second ago too, but it's going to be the remnant of the epiphyseal plate. And this is going to be a disc of hyaline cartilage kind of in the epiphysis, but this is the part that we use to kind of lengthen the bone from childhood until we're full grown. Okay, so here's my epiphysis, and I can see my spongy bone here, and then I can see this epiphyseal line. And again, when your bones are still growing, this would be a line of cartilage that we would continuously sort of add bone to and sort of lengthen that bone until it gets to the proper side. But we'll look a little bit more at that as we look at bone growth in the middle part of the chapter. So now we get the membrane. So we have a periosteum and an endosteum. So my periosteum, peri means around, and osteo is bone, so it's around the bone. So this one is going to cover the external surface of the entire bone, except for the joints, because that's where the hyaline cartilage is going to go. It's going to be an outer layer that's dense, irregular connective tissue, okay? And then the inner layer is going to mostly be these osteogenic stem cells, and again, these are going to be actively dividing cells. So they're richly supplied with nerves, fibers, and blood vessels. And again, the periosteum is that outer part of the bone. So this is the part that I'm going to attach my tendons and my ligaments to. Okay, so I'm attaching my muscles, connecting bones together using my ligaments. And then again, this is where when the muscles contract, they're going to pull on that bone, but they're going to be attaching to that outer layer or that periosteum. Endosteum is within the bone. This is a delicate connective tissue membrane, covers the internal surfaces of bones, covers the trabeculae, okay, of the spongy bone, and it's also going to line the canals that pass through the compact bone. Okay, it contains osteogenic cells again, and anytime you see stem cells, osteogenic cells, you want to remember that these are the ones that can kind of differentiate into other bone cells. And we'll talk about the other cells that are found in bone too. We also get hematopoietic tissue in bones, and we talked about, we have our marrow. So we have red marrow, yellow marrow. The yellow marrow, again, is mostly in the shaft. The red marrow is mostly going to be found in kind of like the spongy bone part or the epiphysis of these long bones. So hematopoietic tissue found in the spongy part of long, flat bones. This is going to be my blood cell production or my red blood cell production. Red marrow is located mostly at the head of the femur and the humerus. So again, this just brings into play like when I fracture these bones. If I fracture the head of the femur or I fracture the head of the humerus, it can disrupt this whole process of making my red blood cells. Okay, so it becomes a little more serious. Yellow marrow is my white blood cells, and again, this is going to be my fat a little bit too. So here is our little picture here, and again, we want to find the diaphysis. We want to find the epiphysis. We want to know that that yellow marrow is more in the diaphysis, in these little cavities, and then in the head of the femur and the humerus. For the epiphysis, this is where we're going to make those red blood cells, okay? And here's just another picture where it gives you just a zoomed in look at all these different little parts again. So very important for our labeling and for our lab practical. And then we're going to move on to the bony marking. So we've already looked at a lot of these. We just didn't, we've memorized these at this point from Chapter 7 and from Chapter 8. So you have all these bone markings on the external surfaces. They're going to be displayed as projections, depressions, openings. We know on every single bone we have all these different little things that we have to label. They're going to serve as attachment sites for muscles, ligaments, tendons. They're going to be joint surfaces. They're going to be openings for blood vessels and nerves. And every single little bone, again, this is our list of landmarks that we needed to memorize for each of the bones of the body. So projections, by definition, are bone markings that bulge outward. They're going to indicate stress. So, anytime your muscles kind of pull on certain parts of the bone, your body's going to try to make those a little bit stronger, and they'll kind of lay down more bone, which will indicate that there's stress and some force is being applied there. You're also going to get depressions or openings. These are going to be sinuses, foramen, grooves. They're allowing nerves and blood vessels to pass through. And here's a picture where we just get a little bit of everything, right? So we get some fossas, we get some projections, a really good picture where we get a lot of different little bones. But again, these are all the little landmarks that we're memorizing and kind of being able to label for our practical. Okay, so now we get to the cells of bone tissue. So you have 5 different types of cells. We have osteogenic cells, we have osteoblast cells, osteocytes, bone lining cells, and then osteoclasts. Okay, and we want to make sure that we know that these are the 5, and we want to just make sure we know a basic definition of each of these and sort of what's their job and what's their role. And for a lot of these chapters, as we kind of finish up our semester, a lot of it, especially on your final, is going to come down to just the basic function and the differences between these types of things. Okay, so we want to know, what do osteoblasts do? What do osteocytes do? What do the osteoclasts do? Because again, these are the most important things from the chapters. So osteogenic cells we mentioned a little bit, but these are the active stem cells. They're found in the periosteum and the endosteum, and then these can differentiate into osteoblasts. Okay, and they can also differentiate into our bone lining cells. But these are, again, actively dividing immature cells, and they'll turn into a bunch of different kinds of cells. Osteoblasts are my bone forming. We talked about blast versus site, as a blast is an immature cell, site is a mature cell. So osteoblast is an immature bone cell. Bone forming cells, they secrete the bone matrix, includes collagen, calcium binding proteins, made up of the initial unmineralized bone, and the proper term for unmineralized, where before we've added in the minerals, is going to be osteoid, and these are going to mature into osteocytes, okay, and then they'll get another job. So important thing to remember here, osteoblast is immature cell, right, and what's it doing for me? It's going to secrete the bone matrix. Then we get to the osteocyte, and again, site tells us this is a mature bone cell, and what this one does is it's going to monitor and maintain the bone matrix for me, but it can also act as a stress strain sensor. And again, this is how my body kind of knows where is my body absorbing stress and where does it need to be a little bit stronger. So it can respond to mechanical stimuli, and then what it does is it's going to send info to cells responsible for bone remodeling. And this is where it can sort of, based on where it's sensing that stress, it can either lay more bone down, or it can start to break bone down and put it in other spots. So a really cool thing to think that your cells are the part that are kind of monitoring what's going on and what's needed in that area. Your bone matrix can also be made or degraded to maintain calcium homeostasis. So we're going to look at how my body monitors my blood calcium levels. So it's always monitoring your blood to kind of sense how much calcium is in there. And if it needs more, it's going to break down your bones, and it's going to take some of that calcium out and put it back into your bloodstream. So bone lining cells are flat cells on the bone surfaces where bone remodeling is not going on. They help to maintain the matrix, and again, these are my periosteal cells and my endosteal cells. And again, those are, remember, my outer covering and the inner covering of the bone. And then lastly, we get to our osteoclasts. These are giant multinucleated cells located at the site of bone resorption, or where we're breaking down bone. And again, they can seal off the area of resorption from the surrounding matrix. So these are my ones where if I need to break the bone down and I need to take some calcium out of there, these are the cells that are going to kind of do that for me. Okay, so breaking down bone resorption, but they don't just break bone down from everywhere. Your body is very specific. It's going to break it down from areas where it feels like it doesn't kind of need that bone to be as strong. Okay, so they can seal things off and take that calcium from just one specific little area. So now we start looking at compact bone. So the osteon, another good multiple choice question. This is going to be the structural unit of compact bone. It's going to be an elongated cylinder. We'll see a picture here in a second. It's going to function as tiny weight-bearing pillars, and you want to kind of think of this as kind of like the rings of a tree trunk. If you cut a tree down and you look at how many rings there are, this is kind of what we're doing with our bones too. You're going to have lamella. They're going to form bone matrix tubes. They're going to be organized, again, like the rings of a tree trunk. You're going to have collagen fibers of adjacent lamella, and they're always going to run in different directions so that they can absorb forces from all these different little directions. And what they're going to do for me is they're going to allow me to sort of withstand any sort of torsion or twisting that is applied to the bones. So let's look at a picture here. So here is my lamella, and I can see where I get all these different little rings, but I also want to remember that I do have these nerves and blood vessels that are going to run through these little channels here too. Here is a bigger picture where I can see all my lamella, and I can see where I have a bunch of these little rings throughout the shaft of the bone and just making up the bone altogether. But again, I come back to this picture from before, and you can see that there's blood vessels and nerves that are traveling through these little channels too. Okay? But this makes your bones really strong and allows them to sort of absorb force from any direction. So now we have a couple other channels. So when you look at this one, you see, okay, I got these little channels. I got my rings, but I can see there's a few other things going on. We just want to make sure we can label and sort of know what the function of those things are too. So we get these canals and these canaliculi. So the central canal runs through the core of each osteon. So this is the main opening through the osteon. And again, it's going to contain small blood vessels, nerve fibers. We're also going to get perforating canals. And again, this is more for labeling purposes, but these are going to lie at 90 degrees to the long axis of the bone. And what I'm doing is just connecting the blood and the nerves together. Okay, canaliculi are the tiny canals, and they're going to allow communication. They're going to allow nutrient waste to be relayed past from one osteocyte or one cell to the next. And what that's going to do for me is it's going to keep my bone cells really well nourished and allow them just to get the nutrients that they sort of need. Okay, so we look at this picture, and then we're going to zoom in here. But I start to see these little perforating canals. So I have my central canal, and then at 90 degrees to the central canal, I'm going to have my perforating canal, and then we'll zoom in on the canaliculi in a second here too. So here's a little zoomed in picture. Right, here's my central canal running all this way, perforating canal, okay, and I start to see my periosteum. I can start to see all the different other little parts, and then I can zoom in and I can see these little canaliculi, okay, and again, these are for nourishment. And when I go back to this one and I look at the perforating canals, this is how I connect all these blood vessels and these nerves within the bone. So again, just make sure you can label them, make sure you know what the basic function of each one of those is going to kind of be. So now we get to the chemical composition of bone, and we looked at this a little bit when we were in chapter 3 and chapter 4. So our bones contain both organic and inorganic substances. Most of the time when you're talking organic versus inorganic, they're talking about carbon. Okay, does something have carbon? So the inorganic part of bone is going to include all the bone cells that we just talked about, and it's also going to contain that include the osteoid, okay? And this is going to be, again, just an organic component. And then the inorganic component is going to be the mineral salts, right? So we talked about unmineralized bone versus mineralized. The organic part is the unmineralized part. So here are our bone cells, or the organic components. We have osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, bone lining cells, osteoclasts, right? All part of those organic components. And then we had our osteoid, which we said was unmineralized bone. So this is my ground substance. Collagen fibers, okay, contribute to the bone structure, flexibility. We get tensile strength, right, that resisting to stretching and twisting. But we haven't added those minerals, and those minerals are going to be the inorganic component. Okay, so now we have our inorganic components. Balance of bone tissue consists of inorganic mineral salts, hydroxyapatite, which is 70%, some other calcium phosphate salts, tiny, tightly packed needle-like crystals in and around the collagen fibers in the extracellular matrix. And what do they do for me? And that's the important part, is that they're going to give bone its exceptional hardness and its ability to resist compression. And this is what also allows them to kind of last so long after we sort of pass away. Okay, so just make sure that you know there's organic, inorganic. The inorganic part is the mineral salts. Okay, so that's the end of part 1 for chapter 6. We'll come back and look at part 2, which is really just how do we sort of form our bones and how do they grow kind of after we're born. And then we'll look at some fractures and things like that when we get to part 3.